All right. So before we started, I would like to all participate to on cam their camera, please. All right. Now, good afternoon, distinguished presenters and participants. Welcome to the panel session of the 5th online seminar on English Linguistics and Literature 2026 with the theme, The Agency of Nature, Forging Ecological Consciousness in the Post-Human Anthropocene. My name is Muhammad Yudhaya Rambang, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this session. Today's panel brings together scholars and researchers to discuss how language, literatures, and cultural narratives engage with one of the most pressing questions of our time, how we understand our relationships with nature in the era of Anthropocene. Through diverse perspectives in linguistics and literary studies, these sessions invite us to rethink nature not merely as a background or a passive object of a human experience, but as an active presence that shapes, influences, and participates in human existence. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our distinguished presenters for today. Right. Speaker 1, Widya Rahmawati Putri, with a presentation entitled Oppression and Resistance in Kelly's Character in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, a Black Feminism Analysis. Speaker 2, Khalilah Aisyah Maharani, with a presentation entitled Questioning Social Expectation Toward Masculinity in Cloud9 by Cheryl Turtle. Speaker 3, Akmalia Rahma Maulina, with a presentation entitled Exploring the Integration of Technology and Environment in Peter Brown's novel, The Wild Robot. Speaker 4, Sabina Aulia Putri, with a presentation entitled Women's Psychological Resilience Against Intergenerational Trauma in Nguyen Van K's Mice, The Mountain Sing. Speaker 5, Davina Putri Wientien, with a presentation entitled Class Anxiety, a Marxist Analysis of Mrs. Bennett in Pride and Prejudice. And lastly, Speaker 6 by Finca Rahmalia, with a presentation entitled The Mechanism of Neocolonialism in Faction System, Veronica's Broad Drogen. Thank you very much to all presenters for joining this academic session. Before we proceed, I would like to briefly explain today's session format. Each presenter will have approximately 10 minutes to deliver their presentation. After all presentations have been completed, we will continue with the discussion sessions and Q&A. Participants are welcome to submit their questions through the chat box. I kindly encourage everyone to actively participate and contribute to this scholarly exchange. All right, now without further delay, let us begin our first presentation. Our first presenter is Widya Rahmawati Putri from Indonesia, with a presentation entitled Oppressions and Resistance in Kelly's Character in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, a Black Feminism Analysis. Please welcome Widya Rahmawati Putri. You may begin your presentation.
Maaf, tapi ini nggak bisa untuk share screen-nya.
Oh, oh. Right. Where's camera control? Mhm. Oops. Sekarang apakah sudah bisa?
Sudah.
Baik. Boleh dimulai ya. Terima kasih.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this occasion, I would like to present my paper with the title Operation and Resistance in Sally's Character in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, a Black Feminism Analysis. The first is introduction. The history of African American women in United States has long been marked by the convergence of multiple forms of structural oppression. During the early 20th century, black women in the American South occupied a particularly vulnerable social position. They face three overlapping forms of oppression. First is racial discrimination, the second is patriarchal domination, and economic deprivation. These first did not operate independent, but rather they reinforced one another, making black women among the most marginalized group in American society. The concept of double and even triple operation among black women has been widely explored in feminist scholarship. Hooks argue that the simultaneously presence of racism, sexism, and classism creates component marginalization. As a result, black women tend to be overlooked in mainstream feminist discourse, which has historically centered on middle-class white women and in civil rights discourse, which often prioritize black men. Alice Walker novel "The Color Purple" set against the backdrop of the segregated American South in the first half of the 20th century. Through the experiences of its main character Sally, Walker constructs a narrative that unfailingly portrays the devastating consequences of patriarchal violence, racial marginalization, and class oppression, while also tracing a journey of resistance, solidarity, and self-determination. The novel was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and National Book Award in 1983, commenting its status is a landmark work within both African American literature and feminist literary tradition. Previous studies has examined analysis operation and resistance as separate or sequential process. Few have examined how race, gender, and class operate simultaneously as an interlocking mechanism of domination and how resistance to this force is articulated within the text itself. Therefore, this study contributes by analyzing sales transformation through Black feminist perspective, emphasizing intersectional oppression and resistance. Unlike previous studies that primarily focus on patriarchal oppression, this study highlights the interconnected operation of race, gender, and class in shaping Shelley's identity for transformation through Black feminist perspective. Previous studies on the color purple have mostly discussed the feminine aspect of it. The first is Benjalul and Salsalab examine how race, gender, and sexuality and class intersect in the operation of black women and found that Sally's transformation reflect the principles of womanism introduced by Walker. The second is James, focused on sisterhood and solidarity among the female characters, showing the bonds between Shelley, Jung, and Sophia, and Squeak serve a key mechanism of survival against patriarchal oppression. The third is Wajiran, explored Walker's contribution to intersectional justice discourse and found the economic ownership, particularly Shelley's interference and saving business marks a turning point in her journey towards self-empowerment. Similarly, Magnum and Rizal trace Shelley's transformation from oppression to empowerment through both black feminist and womanist lens. The third is research methods. The research uses descriptive qualitative method with a literary text analysis approach to examine operation and resistance in Shelley's character in Alice Walker, The Color Purple. The analytical framework applied in this study is Black feminist theory, particularly drawing the works of Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, which examine race, gender, and class oppression experienced by Black women. The data in this study are divided into categories. The first is primary data. The primary data source is Alice Walker novel, The Color Purple, focusing on words, praise, dialogue, and narrative passage that reflect Shelley oppression as resistance. The second is secondary data, consists of peer-reviewed journal articles and books related to Black feminist theory to use support and strengthen the interpretation of primary data. Data analysis procedure in this study is conducted through a close reading and library research. Finding and discussion. The, the first is forms of operation experienced by Shelley. The concept of interlocking operation is central. The two black feminists through Patricia Hill Collins introduced the matrix of domination, arguing that race, gender, and class are not separate hierarchies, but rather systems that mutually shape and structure black women's experiences. In Alice Walker novel, The Color Purple, Shelley embodies the matrix from the first page. Her life is shaped not by a single factor, but by the interconnected force of racial marginalization, patriarchal oppression, and class oppression. Sexual and domestic violence experienced by Shelley. Sexual violence against black women in the American South in early 20th century was with weight and systematically silenced. Bell Hooks argue that institution of slavery normalized the treatment of black women's bodies as property, a legacy that persisted long after emancipation in the form of unplanned sexual exploitation. Sally raped by her stepfather and the Sally abused by the stepfather and Sally abused does not and with the stepfather Sally after Sally married with Albert, Sally continued the experience of physical violence. Sally becomes a victim of ongoing domestic violence. She is beaten for perceived incompetence, timid, or sexually undesirable, and treated as a domestic worker rather than a partner. Albert controls Sally's entire life, including her work at home and her relationship with others. Sally lacks of the freedom and make decisions about her life. Racial marginalization. Poverty, lack of education, and no access to legal protection under a racial system subordinating black communities. The third is class oppression, unpaid domestic labor with no legal recognition of ownership, economic dependency, enforcing subordination. The next is female solidarity as a resistance. Relationship with Sung Aferi and Sophia from a counter-hegemonic community of recognition, support, and consciousness raising. Female solidarity with Sung, the most significant transformative force in Seli liberation through the physiology, spiritually, and practically. Sung reveals our birth-hiddenity, later sparking Seli political awakening and introduced her to saving as economic foundation. Female solidarity with Sophia, an alternative model of resistance, direct rejection of patriarchal control. Her refusal to harbour teaches that women have the right to defend their dignity and that violence need not be accepted. The next is conclusion. Sally's character embodies the three-part structure of interlocking oppression: race, gender, and class, each reinforcing the others to produce radical marginalization across colonial structural, disciplinary, and hegemonic and interpersonal domains. Resistance emerges primarily from the female solidarity with Sung and Sophia, enabling progressive liberation across economic, psychological, and epistemological dimensions, culminating in self-definition. Thank you for the time. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay. Thank you very much for Widya Rahmawati Putri for your insightful presentation. Now, we have explored about her presentation, which provides an important perspective on the relationships between human narratives and the ecological concerns. Now, we will move to our second presentation. Our next presenter is Khalilah Aisyah Maharani from Indonesia, with the title of presentation, Questioning Social Expectation Toward Masculinity in Cloud9 by Cheryl Turtle. Please welcome Khalilah Aisyah Maharani. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the time. I'm gonna share screen first. Wait. Okay, is the presentation visible? Is my voice clear enough?
Yes, clear.
Okay, I will start from here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khalilah Aisyah Maharadi from English Literature, Faculty Languages and Arts, University Negeri Semarang. Today, I'm going to present my research about questioning social expectation towards masculinity in Cloud9 by Carol Churchill. So we are actually going to start from background. Social expectation function as a powerful framework that shapes how people build their identities and behave in public. These expectations often force individuals to follow strict societal rules, deeply rooted in patriarchal culture, which people usually accept unquestioningly and dictate behavioral standards from both women and men. Social expectation also shape masculine identity by encouraging men to be strong, dominant, emotionally restrained, and distant from femininity. Men who fail to meet these expectations are often marginalized or pressured to conform. We move to the literature review. So I'm gonna introduce to you guys what is Cloud9 by Carol Churchill. So Carol Churchill's play Cloud9 is set initially in Victorian colonial Africa and later in 1917's London. The play explores the intersection of colonialism, gender identity, and societal expectations. In Act 1, Clive, as the head of the family, controls everyone by forcing natural roles. Clive's logic also causes pain for Edward and his hidden love for dolls, or Ellen's forced marriage, where she actually wants to be an independent woman. While existing scholarships on Cloud9 has rigorously mapped the trajectories of liberation and resistance, the critical discourse has disproportionately focused on female agency, which is feminism. Betty's domestic subjugation and subsequent identity crisis have become foundational to the play's reception. And Mir in 2025 also explains how Victorian era patriarchal norms are in intrinsically linked to how male authority dictates woman's body, desires, and roles within the family structure. However, the nuanced mechanics of masculinity as a restrictive and potentially self-destructive force for men, it still remain under theorized. Next slide, please. This is my research objective. To explore this, I have two main objectives, which is number one, to identify how the masculine actions in the play differ from the expectations of the Victorian period. And then the second one is to explore how these different versions of masculinity challenge traditional social standards and criticize patriarchal power. I I'm gonna introduce to you guys my theoretical framework. So I'm using Global Masculinism by Nicholas and Agius from 2018. And in their theoretical framework, they explain that masculinity is a socially constructed ideology and not a natural biological identity. Nicholas and Agius also define masculinism as an underlying ethos or totalizing worldview that implicitly universalize and privilege the qualities of masculinity, and in doing so, they are subordinates and others alternative ways of understanding, knowing, and being. Masculine norms operate as a hidden logic that shapes social expectations and everyday behavior. Next, please. This is the methodology that I use as I use a qualitative literary studies. The analytical process is conducted in three systematic stages. First of all, I'm doing the identification first, where relevant textual cues are identified and categorized based on domestic expectations of masculinity versus the resistance exhibited by characters. And then second, I'm doing elaboration where I categorize the categorize of the textual evidence or analyze using Nicholas and Agius theory to explain how specific behaviors are normalized or glorified within the play's patriarchal context. And then lastly, I'm doing synthesis, which is I make a final conclusions regarding how this diverse manifestation of masculinity challenge the socio-historical standards of the eras depicted in the play. This is the outline of the findings. There's actually differences in action of masculinity towards Victorian era masculinity expectations represented in the story. The Victorian image of masculinity depicted in Carl George's Cloud9 action has two kinds, namely physical competence and emotional restraints. And in Cloud9 first, there's actually explicitly shows the standard of being masculine in the terms of physical ability and action. The first expectation is that being masculine means being capable using tools. For information, flogging is the act of beating or whipping person, usually as a form of physical punishment or torture with the using of rod, whips, and straps. Although both Nicholas and Agius do not specifically identify tool use as a masculine trait, the ability to participate in physical punishment and handle the instruments are associated with it becomes one way of performing masculine authority. Men who are unwilling to engage in such practice, such as Harry Beckley, risk being viewed as inferior by those who follow the dominant norm. And then the second expectation is that masculine means being good at sport, because there's actually one scene where Clive, which is the father figure in the story, mocked Edward, which is his son, for being considered unskilled at catchball and immediately assumed that Edward would be a poor cricket player. And then there's a third expectation, which is uh, need to be not being allowed to play with dolls. And then this expectation reflects a form of masculinity that depends on maintaining a clear distinction between masculine and feminine behaviors. Edward's attachment to the doll therefore becomes something wrong because it blurs the boundaries upon which Victorian gender norms are built. The next finding, still a form of masculinity that depicted in the story, is actually means that masculinity in the Victorian era are actually requires ones to be good attitudes and emotional suppression. The first expectation is that being masculine or requires to respecting and obeying. By presenting Clive as a role model for Edward, the play reveals that how Victorian society expected boys to respect their father and grow into the same masculine role as their fathers do. And then there's actually another expectation that masculine need to force self when necessary. So there's one of the scene where Edward stated that I don't like women, I don't like dolls, and it actually appears right after Clive accepts his apology and indicating that Edward's sudden declaration of dislike for women and dolls suggests not a genuine change in preference, but rather an attempt to conform to the masculine standard imposed upon him. And then there's actually another expectation that associated with masculinity, which is the responsibility to provide. And the form of providing is not limited to the ability to support the family, but also other things such as providing security. One day in the story, Edward managed to get Betty's necklace after it got stolen, and Clive, who's recognized the moment thought Edward's actions were very manly. He frames Edward's achievement to provide security to associate it with masculine responsibility within Victorian society. And then there's also another expectation where men are expected to be emotionless. And Nicholas and Agius already explained how vulnerability has long been grouped into feminine traits. And then Edward's hurt feelings are treated not as a normal emotion response, but a behavior that falls outside the masculine ideal. This is actually shown in one of the scene in the story where Clive, which is his father, state that a boy has no business having feelings. And then next slide. Beside the characters demonstrate several differences that challenge the standard and masculinity expected by Victorian society, there's difference that question the social standard. Churchill this time portrays more some form of questioning moments throughout the play by presenting subtle hesitation, rejection of the father, and questioning heteronormative masculinity. Through these findings, the story is shown how in Victorian societies the father functioned as the primary model through which masculine values are transmitted to the next generation. And Churchill, from these challenge or questioning moments, she exposed that masculinity not as a natural identity, but as an identity that must be tough, enforced, and maintained. Churchill also chose this moment to allow Edward to despise his father, since father-son relationship is one of the primary sites where masculine values are transmitted. This demonstrates that masculine ideals are neither universally accepted nor naturally embraced. Churchill also questions the social expectations that masculinity must conform to heterosexual norms through the character of Harry Beckley. Through the physical gesture that Harry gives to Clive are considered crosses the boundary of acceptable masculine behavior within Victorian societies. And this reaction also demonstrates how heteronormative masculinity is maintained by labeling alternative forms of masculinity as dangerous and unacceptable. The story also exposed how masculinism norms work in excluding men who do not conform to heterosexual expectations or other form of expectation even when someone is male. From all of these findings, I conclude that the findings reveal that Cloud9 portrays ideal masculinity through a series of social expectations related to physical competence and emotional restraints, and male characters are expected to demonstrate many expectations. These expectations reflect what Nicholas and Agius describe masculinism as a moral voice that maintains and naturalizes masculine qualities as the global standard. However, through characters such as Edward and Harry Bagley, the play exposes the tensions, difficulties, and exclusion created by masculine norms. This play they also demonstrate that masculine expectations require continuous social enforcement and question the social expectation by revealing their dependence on conformity rather than real quality of man. This is the references that I use to um, understand more about my research. And then, thank you so much for attention.
Thank you very much for Khalilah Aisyah Maharani for your insightful presentation. We have explored about masculinity, which provides an important perspective about how masculinity can affect both gender, man and woman, the way we live and even the way they socialize. Now, we will move to our third presentation. Our third presenter is Akmalia Rahma Maulina with a presentation entitled Exploring the Integration of Technology and Environment in Peter Brown's novel The Wild Robot. Please welcome Akmalia Rahma Maulina. We are ready to receive your presentation.
Is it visible?
I'm sorry.
Wait. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my research today. My name is Amalia Rahma Maulina, and today I would like to present my final project with the title Exploring the Integration of Technology and Environment in Peter Brown's novel, The Wild Robot. In this presentation, I will explain the background of my study, a theoretical framework that I use, my research method, the finding and discussion, and finally the conclusion of my research. Before discussing my research, I would like to briefly involve The Wild Robot, written by Peter Brown in 2016, is a children's novel that combines adventure, environmental themes, and science fiction. The story follows Rose as a robot who accidentally arrived on a remote island after a shipwreck. At first, Rose is completely unfamiliar with the island and rejected by the animal because she is seen as a strange machine. However, instead of trying to dominate the environment, Rose gradually learned to how to survive by observing nature, communicating with the animal, building shelter, and caring for the orphan gosling named Brightbill. And as the story developed, Rose transformed from an outsider into an accepted member of the island community. And this transformation makes the wild robot more than just a survival story, and it raises important question about whether technology and nature must have opposite of each other, or um, something that can coexist in a harmonious way. Okay, the first one is introduction. Uh, Environmental issues such as climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss have become global concern because many environmental problems are caused by industrialism and technological development. And technology is often viewed as the main cause of the environmental destruction. And at the same time, technology is also expected to provide solutions to these environmental challenges. And as a result, society tends to see technology and nature as two opposing forces that cannot easily coexist together. But in recent literary works, especially children's literature and stories involving artificial intelligence or robot, begins to challenge this traditional perspective. Um, Like according from the previous study, narratives such as The Wild Robot encourage the reader to reconsider the relationship between technology and natural world instead of portraying technology as enemy of nature, and the novel presents the possibility that technology became part of ecological community through adaptation, cooperation, and responsibility. Okay, the next slide. Okay, the next slide is theoretical framework, including previous study. The previous study entrusted truth in the world and ecological reading of identity of and belonging in the wild robot. This research applied Gregory's critical framework, particularly in the concept of wilderness and dwelling, to examine Rose's journey from an outsider to the guardian of the forest. The researchers successfully showed that Rose's transformation challenges the traditional belief that humans and nature of technology and nature must always be separated. Instead, they argued that belonging is achieved through adaptation and responsibility toward the environment. Uh, and as a result, they successfully demonstrated how Rose's journey from outsider and to forest guardians subvert traditional ecological dichotomies. But however, the study mainly focused on the 2024 film adaptation rather than Peter Brown's original 2006 novel. Because film often simplify or omit important narrative detail, there is still room to examine the novel itself in greater depth. In the next previous study, the second previous study is Human Ethic and the Maternal AI in Peter Brown's The Wild Robot. This research analyzes Rose from the perspective of posthumanism, and it explores how Rose developed from an ordinary machine into maternal figures who care for Bright Bill and demonstrate empathy, responsibility, and ethical decision making. The study concludes that Rose challenges anthropocentric ideas by showing that machine can also demonstrate moral values that are traditionally associated with humans. Although the analysis is comprehensive, it also uses posthumanism as theoretical framework, and it doesn't connect cross transformation with ecofetism, especially current concept with wilderness and dwelling. But this research um, successfully analyzed cross-maternal AI role and challenged anthropocentric moral framework. But however, use of posthumanism alone without integration with ecofetism from God. Okay, the Greek eco-criticism, the first one, wilderness, cultural metaphor, casts non-humanism landscape post-hostile alien on sublime space await human mastery comprehension from Garrett. And the second key concept is dwelling, which is process where being inhabited place ethically and relationally, not just physical, and implies intimacy and reciprocity. And the application to the water robot, the wilderness, analyze how island is depict a system that reshape Ross, and the application of dwelling, analyze Ross adaptation process, which is caregiving, shelter building, and learning animal languages. The methodology. The study adopted qualitative descriptive analytical study as the approach of the research and using Peter Brown's The Wild Robot novel as the primary data. And the data collection method is close reading with the key episode of first learning, caregiving, environmental, and modification, and the data collection using reading and collecting textual data from the novel and previous study. And the analytical procedure, the first one is identify wilderness and dwelling scene in the novel, like island description and Ross adaptation process. The next one is finding and discussion. In this opportunity, I will answer the first research question. The first finding demonstrates process transformation through the act of building shelter, as stated in the novel. Rose built a shelter for herself from branches and mud, and later constructed walls for the animals. And this quotation shows that Rose doesn't attempt to dominate or change the island for her own benefit. Instead, she adapts to the existing environment by using natural materialism and creating safe places for both herself and other living creatures. And from God's perspective, this represents the beginning of the dwelling because Rose starts participating in the ecosystem rather than remaining an outsider. And at the same time, the island also changed Rose. Living in nature teaches her new ways of surviving, cooperating, and corresponding to environmental challenges. On the second findings, the novel states Rose became the guardian of the forest as he protected the animals from the hunters and preserved the natural balance of the island. And this scene represents a much deeper level of dwelling. Rose no longer survives only for herself. Instead, she actively protects the entire ecosystem and takes responsibility for maintaining ecological balance. According to Garrett, true dwelling is characterized by ethical commitment to place. And from Haraway perspective, this scene also reflects the idea of the cyborg. Although Rose is a machine, she performed the role of an ecological guardian, and this challenges the traditional assumption that only biological beings can protect nature. Instead of dominating the environment, Rose becomes a responsible participant within it. And the next is discussion. The findings show that Rose's journey from technological alienation to ecological belonging, and the first process in this adaptation, as Rose learns to survive by observing the island. And the second is communication when she learns the animal languages and develop mutual understanding. And the third is caregiving, especially through raising Brightbill and helping other animals. And the fourth is responsibility, which is reflected as her role as the protector of the forest. And finally, fire process is ecological restoration, where Rose contribute positively to maintaining the balance of ecological. And these five process demonstrate that belonging is achieved not through biological identity, but through ethical action, cooperation, and responsibility through the environment. In conclusion, the world robot challenged the deepest assumption of environmental talk by showing that technology and nature are not antagonistic domains but interconnected systems. The novel teaches us that ecological belonging is an enacted relation, not a biological status, and that machine can participate in ecological process constructively. Thank you so much. That's all for me.
Thank you very much for Akmalia Rahma Maulina for your insightful presentation. We have explored Peter Brown's novel The Wild Robots, which provides a very meaningful harmony between artificial creations and the natural world. Now we will move to our fourth presentation. Our fourth presenter is Sabrina Aulia Putri with a presentation entitled Woman's Psychological Resilience Against Intergenerational Trauma in Nguyen Van Case Mice, The Mountain Sings. For Sabrina Aulia Putri, the floor is yours. Uh, I'm sorry, but the voice is not clear.
Is it already clear now?
Yes, it is clear now. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Okay. Let me try again from the very first. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, respected lecturers and all the participants. First of all, thank you for giving me all the opportunity to present my research today. My name is Sabrina Putri, and in this presentation, I would like to discuss my research entitled Women's Psychological Resilience Against Intergenerational Trauma in Nguyen Van Quet The Mountain Sing. The study explores two important issues presented in the novel. The first is how traumatic experiences can be passed from one generation to another, even to people who never directly experienced the traumatic events themselves. The second is how women respond to those inherited traumatic experiences by developing psychological resilience that allows them to survive, adapt, and continue living despite the suffering they inherit. In this presentation, I will explain the background of the study, the research gap, and the theoretical framework, the research method, and the finding, and the last one is the conclusion. Okay, before discussing the research itself, I would like to briefly introduce the literary work that became the object of this study. The novel The Mountain Sing was written by Nguyen Van Quet and published in 2020. It is a historical fiction novel inspired by the history of Vietnam. The story centers on two female protagonists, Tran Dulan and her granddaughter, Huang. Through their lives, readers witness several significant historical events in Vietnam, such as the Great Hunger, the Land Reform Campaign, and the Vietnam War. However, the novel is not only about historical events. More importantly, it illustrates how those events continue to affect later generations emotionally and psychologically. Through the character of the granddaughter, whose name is Huang, she does not personally experience many of these tragedies, but she inherits their emotional impact through the stories, memories, and silence within her family. This makes the novel suitable for examining the concepts of intergenerational trauma and psychological resilience, especially from women's perspective. Okay, after reviewing previous studies, I found that there are 6 journal articles related to this topic. The studies discuss several themes, including historical trauma, collective memory, inherited trauma, post-memory, cultural resilience, and the long-term impacts of the Vietnam War. Although these studies contribute to valuable insights, they mainly focus on trauma or memory separately. None of them specifically analyze the mountain thing by combining Kathy Carey's trauma theory with the discussion of women's psychological resilience. Therefore, this research attempts to fill that gap. Rather than only identifying trauma, the study also examines how female characters overcome inherited trauma and how resilience becomes an important strategy for survival and healing. Based on the research gap, the study addresses 2 research questions. The first question asks how generational trauma is represented in the mountain chain. In other words, I investigate how traumatic experiences are transmitted from one generation to another through family relationship and collective memory. The second question examines how the female characters demonstrate psychological resilience in dealing with inherited trauma. Corresponding to this question, this research has 2 objectives. First, to analyze how traumatic experiences are transmitted across generations through family narratives and inherited memories. Second, to examine how resilience enables the female characters to survive difficult circumstances, adapt to emotional suffering, forgive the past, and maintain family continuity. And this objective guides the entire analysis presented in the study. To answer those research questions, the study employs Kathy Carey's trauma theory, which include in unclaimed experience, trauma narrative, and history from 1996. So according to Carey, trauma is not always understood at the moment when it happened. Instead, its effects often appear much later through recurring memories, emotional responses, or psychological distress. There are 3 concepts from her theory that became the analytical framework of this research. The first concept is belatedness. This concept explains that traumatic experiences are often recognized only after some time has passed because the mind cannot immediately process overwhelming events. The second concept is traumatic memory. This concept, if trauma continues to exist through fragment memories, repeated recollections, emotional pain, and even silence within the family. And the last one is trauma transmission. This concept explains that trauma can be inherited by later generations through storytelling, family narrative, emotional interaction, and shared memories. These 3 concepts are used to analyze how trauma developed throughout the novel and how it influenced different generations of the family. The study applies a qualitative descriptive method because the primary data consists of words, dialogue, narrative, descriptions, and quotations found in the novel. Since the purpose of the research is to interpret meanings rather than measure numerical data, this method is considered the most appropriate. The data analysis was conducted through several stages. First, I carefully read the novel several times to gain a comprehensive understanding of the story. Second, I identified passages related to the trauma and resilience. And the last one is I inventoried and classified the relevant data according to the 3 concepts proposed by Kathy Garrett and also interpreted the data using her trauma theory to explain how trauma and resilience are represented in the novel. Now I would like to move to the findings. The first finding concerned the representation of intergenerational trauma. The quotation presented on this slide demonstrates that family stories play an essential role in preserving collective memory. Through her grandmother's storytelling, Huang gradually learns about the painful experiences suffered by previous generations. Although she never directly witnesses those traumatic events, she emotionally experiences their consequences. This indicates that trauma is not limited to direct victims. Instead, trauma can continue across generations through inherited memories, emotional suffering, and family narrative. Therefore, the novel portrays trauma as something that survives beyond historical events themselves and continues to shape the psychological experiences of the descendants. The second finding focuses on women's psychological resilience. Unlike the previous finding that emphasizes inherited suffering, this section highlights the character's ability to heal and move forward. The quotation on this slide shows that when the grandmother or Trandilan eventually chooses forgiveness instead of continuing hatred toward the descendant of those who harm her family. This decision represents an important psychological transformation. Rather than allowing the trauma to define the future, she actively breaks the cycle of inherited hatred. From this finding, resilience can be understood not merely as surviving the difficult experiences, but also as developing emotional strength, maintaining hope, accepting painful memories, and creating opportunities for healing. So women become the central figures who pursue family continuity while preventing trauma from being endlessly transmitted to future generations. Based on the analysis, the study reaches two major conclusions. First, the mountain saying represents intergenerational trauma through family narrative, inherited memories, and emotional experience that continue to influence later generations. Trauma is therefore portrayed not only as an individual experience, but also as a collective experience shared within families. And then the second one is the novel demonstrates that women's psychological resilience developed through endurance, adaptation, hope, forgiveness, and the commitment to maintaining family continuity. These qualities enable the female characters to transform painful experiences into sources of strength rather than allowing trauma to control their lives. To conclude the research, this study also demonstrates that category trauma theory provides an effective framework for understanding both the persistence of trauma and the development of resilience across generations. Thank you so much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for Sabrina Aulia Putri for your insightful presentation. We have explored about how painful historical trauma can transform grief into a legacy of resilience and healing. Now, we will move to our fifth presentation. Our fifth presenter is Davina Putri Wientient with a presentation entitled Class Anxiety, a Marxist Analysis in Mrs. Bennett in Pride and Prejudice. Please welcome Davina Putri Wientient.
Okay, hello. First of all, I would like to ask, is the presentation visible and my voice is clear?
Yes, everything clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Davina Putri. Here I am about to present my research titled Class Anxiety, Marxist Analysis of Mrs. Bennett in Pride and Prejudice. So there is a table of contents of my presentation. The first is introduction, theoretical framework, methodology, result and discussion, and the last is conclusion. So to begin with, social class is largely determined by economic condition and access to wealth. However, class does not only affect a person's social position, it also shapes the way individuals think, behave, and perceive themselves with society. So one important psychological consequences of this is class anxiety. In Austen's Pride and Prejudice, It provides a clear representation of these class dynamics in Regency England. Because women had limited economic opportunities, marriage became one of the few ways to secure financial stability and social status. And among the characters in the novel, Mrs. Bennet is the best illustration of class anxiety. So her constant determination to find wealthy husbands for her daughter is not merely a personal obsession, but it reflects her deep concern about her family's financial insecurity and uncertain social future, especially of the entailment of the Bennet estate. So this study will examine how socio-economic structures shape Mrs. Bennet's psychological disposition and social behavior through a Marxist perspective, supported with Pierre Bourdieu concept. Moving to the theoretical framework, in here we have society is divided into classes based on ownership of property and relationship to the means of production, resulting in equal distribution of power and opportunity that shape individuals' identity. So this study will adopt Marxist literary criticism as its main theoretical framework. It also incorporate with Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus. So Marx in here will help how the people's consciousness that determines the assistant, but their social assistant that shapes their consciousness. In other words, material and economic condition in which people live influence how they think and behave. Also, the Pierre Bourdieu's concept helps explain how external class structure become internalized and reflected in Mrs. Bennett's behavior. Next slide. So this study is using qualitative methodology. It allows an in-depth interpretation of literary texts, particularly in understanding Mrs. Bennett's class anxiety and the influence of socioeconomic structure on her psychological disposition and social behavior. The primary data of this study consists of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice novel, while the secondary data include books and peer-reviewed journal articles that related to Marxist literary criticism, border sociology, class anxiety, social class. And this research, conducted in 4 steps. First is a close reading of Pride and Prejudice to gain a comprehensive understanding of the novel and its socio-economic context. The second step is the data identification. So I identified and extracted textual evidence, including dialogues, narration, and character interaction that reflected Mrs. Bennet's class anxiety. The third step is thematic categorization. The collected data, according to the operational indicators, I categorize into fear of downward mobility, obsession with marriage as an economic strategy, hypersensitivity to wealth and social status, preoccupation with reputation, and strategic social behavior aimed at maintaining and improving class position. And the last is Marxist and Bourdieu's interpretation. So I analyze the categorized data using Marxist literary criticism as the primary analytical framework, supported by Bourdieu's concept of habitus. And this combination enabled me to explain how material conditions shape Mrs. Bennet's class anxiety. Moving into the result and discussion. So socioeconomic structure is shaping Mrs. Bennet and class anxiety. So from a Marxist perspective, class is determined by a person's relationship to wealth and property. Although the Bennets belong to the gentry, they are not financially secure. The social status depends on long-born estate, but because of the entail system, the estate cannot be inherited by Mrs. Bennet or her 5 daughters. Instead, it must pass to the male relative, Mr. Collins. In here, the quotation, "It is a grievous affair to my poor girls. You must confess there is no knowing how the sale will go once they come to be entailed." So this quotation shows that Mrs. Bennet is not simply complaining about an unfair legal rule. She is worried about its real economic consequences because property determines wealth and security. the entail threatens her family's future. It aligns with Marx's statement that the mode of production or of material life condition the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. So, in other words, Marx argues that people's idea and ways of thinking are shaped by the material condition in which they live. Likewise, Mrs. Bennet's consciousness is shaped by the economic structure surrounding her rather than by individual personality. So, in Regency England, women generally could not inherit it entailed estate and had very limited control over property after marriage. Since Mrs. Bennet has no son, neither she nor her daughter have any legal claim to Lombard. At the same time, the family has 5 unmarried daughters and limited financial resources. As a result, marriage became an economic necessity rather than a simply romantic choice. In here, the business of her life was to get her daughters married, and its solace was visiting and news. Austen illustrates this through Mrs. Bennet's constant focus on marrying off her daughter. From a Marxist perspective, it demonstrates ideology. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels argue that the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. So society teaches that a woman's primary role is to marry well, that a man's value depends on his property, and that inheritance laws are simply natural. As Eagleton also explained, ideology becomes a part of everyday life, so people accept these social roles without questioning them. Therefore, Mrs. Bennet's obsession with marriage is not a mere personal preference, but an ideological response to the material condition of society. This also reflects the Marx theory of historical materialism, which argues that the changes in economic relations reshape social institutions. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels even state that capitalism has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. In other words, marriage functions not as a romantic relationship, but also an economic transaction. Next slide is Mrs. Bennet's ideological consciousness. So, according to Eagleton, ideology is the way people live out of their roles in class society. That means people usually do not realize they are acting according to the ideology because those ideas appear natural and unquestionable. This is exactly what happens to Mrs. Bennet. She never questions why women cannot inherit property or whether the inheritance system is fair. Instead, she accepts these conditions as normal and focuses all her energy on finding wealthy husband for her daughters. This ideological condition can be seen in her reaction to Mrs. Bingley's arrival. Before considering his personality, Mrs. Bennet immediately values him based on his income and social status. It can be seen in the quotation here: a single man of large fortune, 4 or 5 thousand a year. What a fine thing for our girls. So this reflects Marx's argument that it is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. In other words, people's thought and values are shaped by the material condition in which they live. Since women in Regency England could not inherit property, Mrs. Bennet literally sees marriage as the only realistic way to secure her daughter's future. Also, therefore, from a Marxist perspective, Mrs. Bennet's action should not be seen as irrational or merely personal. Instead, they are shaped by the socio-economic structure and the ideology of her society, which have led her to accept that values of the marriage market as natural and unquestionable. So the conclusion is Mrs. Bennet's class anxiety is produced by the socio-economic structure of Regency England rather than by her individual personality. The Bennet family, insecure position, the entail system, and the women's exclusion from property ownership make marriage an economic necessity. These material conditions shape Mrs. Bennet's consciousness and lead her to internalize the ideology that marriage is the primary means of achieving security and preserving class status. Thus, from a Marxist perspective, her behavior reflects the interaction between material condition, ideology, and class reproduction rather than merely personal disposition. So here all the key references of my study is just a several, and that is all from my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Davina Putri Wendian, for your insightful presentation. We have explored how class anxiety is not determined only by a single individual, but a complex system. Right. Now we move to our sixth presentation. Our sixth presenter is Vinka Rahmalia with a presentation entitled The Mechanism of Neocolonialism in Faction System, Veronica Ross Divergent. Please welcome Vinka Rahmalia. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for your opportunity. My name is Vintara Malia, and today I'll be presenting an article titled "The Mechanism of Neocolonialism in Faction System Veronica Roth Divergence." The first, we look at the background. What is neocolonialism? Neocolonialism is a modern form of domination that no longer relies on military occupation, but instead operates through ideology, culture, education, politics, and knowledge. As the Kwame Nkrumah, neocolonialism usually produces future results that were previously unimaginable, but the way it is done to trick it can be very dangerous. As explained by Edward Said, dominant ideologies are often accepted as normal by society, making domination less visible but more effective. Domination is implemented not just through physical means, but it also creates through language, influencing the way specific groups are viewed and situated. This is the definition of Divergent novel. Divergent is a novel of American author Veronica Roth, published by HarperCollins Children's Book in 2011. This novel is a young adult science fiction adventures novel genre. Divergent shows the human living in the future that live in 5 factions: abnegations, erudites, dauntless, amity, and candor. This factional division turned out to be a form of colonialism disguised as regulation that promised peace and security. Okay, in this study, we have two research problems and then the two objectives of the study. The first is, how does the faction system reflects the Gramsci concept of hegemony? And the second, we have, how does the faction system function as a mechanism of neocolonialism in Divergent? And this study, we have an objective to analyze the faction system using Gramsci theory of hegemony. And then to identify mechanism of neocolonialism through fashion system in Divergent. Here are several previous studies. They are most used in this study. The first is Primananda in 2015 describes how the fashion system operates as a strong method of social control by imposing strict identity boundaries, inhibiting personal expression, and sustaining stereotype among groups. The second is Angreni, and in 2017 analyzed how political power is constructed and sustained through ideological influence, which shape the behavior and mindset of individuals within the faction system. And the third is Praskirti, interpreting faction system as a form of class struggle within a hierarchical social system. This study seeks to address the current gaps in previous studies by examining that faction system is also a form of neocolonialism. In analyzing the faction system in Veronica Roth's Divergent, this study employs Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony to examine how dominance is maintained not merely through coercion, but through the consent of subordinate groups. Gramsci's concept highlights the role of ideological and cultural control in securing power, which in the context of Divergent is reflected in the social norms, faction-based education, and moral values that shape individual behavior. Okay. And then we have the method, the theoretical framework. Antonio Gramsci, this research is based on Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony. It argues that power isn't just maintained by force or coercion, but also it's maintained through consent. People willingly accept that rules because the dominant ideology is embedded in education, culture, and social institutions. The main concepts used from Gramsci are ideology, consent, education, cultural domination, and social control. Now, the process of hegemony. It's a five-step process. The first is a ruling class, and then the ideology. The ideology spread through the education and culture. The third, once people grow up with this ideology, they give their consent. They think it's normal and natural. And then finally, the result in the hegemony. So in the context of Divergent, we can see the faction as a ruling class, they spread ideology that one virtue is enough through education and culture. As a result, people consent to the system, and that's how the faction system creates hegemony and acts as neocolonialism. Next, let's look at the research method used in this study. The first is research design. The study used a qualitative descriptive approach. That means I focus on describing and interpreting meaning from the text, not by numbers. The second, the primary data, the main source is the novel Divergent by Veronica Roth. The third is secondary data, like books, journals, than the previous studies. And the fourth, the theory. I used two main theories. Anthony Gramsci theory of hegemony, and Kwame Nkrumah concept of neocolonialism. For the data analysis process, there are 5 steps. The first is reading the novel, and then identify key scene and dialogues related to the faction system. The 3 is categorize data, and then analyze those categories using Gramsci and Nkrumah theories, and then interpret the findings. The faction system work as neocolonialism. In short, I read the novel, find the evidence, and then analyze it using hegemony and neocolonial theory to answer the research problem. Hegemony and in the faction system, there are several evidence of hegemony. Faction before blood. Without a faction, we have no purpose and no reason to live. They can define the norms of their factions. Based on the evidence of hegemony, the interpretation is ideology is internalized through social institution, loyalty shift from family to the faction, individual identity is shaped by the system, and then consent makes domination appear. The key point, power is maintained through consent rather than coercion, reflecting Gramsci theory of hegemony. Then the factionless and the divergent. Factionless and divergent reveal how Gramsci's hegemony operates through exclusion and ideological control, while the factionless become marginalized. The divergent threaten the dominant ideology because they cannot be fully controlled. They're factionless and divergent. And then the result and discussion, erudite as the dominant elite. Erudite as the dominant elite, they have evidence human reason can excuse any evil. Knowledge is transformed into an instrument of political domination rather than liberating society. Intelligence legitimizes unequal powers relations. Then the mechanism of neocolonialism, from faction system to neocolonialism. This slide shows how the faction system and divergence work as a mechanism of neocolonialism. There are 5-step process. The first, the function system. The 5 factions are used to organize the entire society. Second, identity control. People are forced to choose and live with one fixed identity for life. They can be more than one thing. Third, this creates a social hierarchy. Some factions like erudite and dauntless have more power and status than others like immediate or abnegations. The fourth, dependence, because their identity is tied to a faction, people become dependent on the system for their sense of belonging and purpose. And then finally, this leads to neocolonialism. It's ideological domination through consent. People follow the system not because of force, but because they believe it is only way to live. Besides on this process, we found 6 key mechanisms based on this process. The first is identity control, social classification, ideological domination, knowledge as a power, structural dependency, and social exclusion. So the faction system doesn't use army to control people. It's controlled them by defining who they are, where they are belong, and making them depend on it. That's how it works as neocolonialism. In conclusion, this study found that the faction system in Divergent novel operates as both as a hegemonic and neo-colonial structure through internalized ideology, control social roles, and systematic exclusion. Society upholds order while limiting individual freedom. The theory of hegemony by profiting colonization without realizing it through the existing system clearly form a mechanism of neocolonialism. The novel ultimately reveals that power is most effective when it is accepted as natural instead of being enforced through overpower. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Finka Rahmalia, for your insightful presentation. We have explored how neocolonialism manipulates our populations to sustain an absolute dominance of a ruling elite. Now we have another seven presenter. Our seventh presenter is Raka Nadif Ibrahim with a presentation entitled The Death of Absolute Morality Depicted in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Please welcome Raka Nadif Ibrahim. The floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, thank you, but I think there's a little bit of a problem with my device to share this presentation. If all of you can wait for a while, I can share the presentation. Sorry for the inconvenience, first of all.
That's okay.
Okay. Can you see my screen, or is it hasn't been shared yet?
Not showed yet.
Okay. So wait, hold on for a minute. Okay. All right. Is it present yet or hasn't been present yet? Or I just going to share a screen uh from this.
I'm sorry, it hasn't been present yet, but
Okay. Okay.
if it's art, it's okay if you don't use a presentation PPT.
Okay. Can you see the screen from my phone because I just used my phone because my laptop is it been appeared yet on the screen?
No, it's not has been appeared yet, but if it's hard, it's okay if you don't use a PPT or presentation.
Okay. Okay, is my screen already like being shared or something?
Yes, your screen already appeared.
Is the screen already been shared?
Uh, Accept
Okay.
the
So
presentations.
all right. Is it already been shared or yeah, does the presentation already been on the screen yet?
Yes,
Okay, okay,
yes, it
okay.
is.
So all right. Good afternoon,
Thank you.
everyone. I'm very grateful to be in this conversation in this group to have a discuss about my findings about this thesis on the death of absolute morality depicted in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And so the theme of these findings is that why did I choose the name or the title The Death is because I choose it specifically because I actually found something that is very interesting about this modern world that is correlate with the 19th century the 19th century literary work that is somehow it's kind of like correlates in between that we as humans is kind of like can relate to something as well. So let me share a bit. So about the overview, sorry, about the overview is that one for the research background, the concept of the absolute morality is increasingly being questioned in this modern era. So in this modern eras as well, Dostoevsky's from the 19th century works serves as a rich and relevant medium for the exploring moral issues and also the ethical dilemmas. And for the research gap, the previous studies have primarily focused on the physical, on the psychological and religious dimensions of the character. However, postmodernism interpretation of the collapse of the absolute morality of the morality in the novel remains relatively limited. And so, from the goals from what I research, is that in this study aims at the analysis how Dostoevsky portrays the collapse of absolute morality through the characterization and also narrative structure and the crime of punishment, which is the literary work. And also for the method on theory is that the research employs the postmodernism, particularly of the theories of Lyotard and also of Michel Foucault, as its theoretical framework. It adopts a qualitative research design using a close reading approach on the analysis from the novel. So this is like the base on of how what I feel like this what my presentation is going to be. And so from the research background is that why morality is still being relevant now in this modern age from the usage of AI, which has risen with more question and then answers as well, which is from what we also know is that the rampage usage of modernization of globalization is somehow being actually like what is it called As a reason, more question than also answer, is it morally good or is it morally bad? And also for the second one, the global moral polarization continues to intensify, with many social conflicts rooted in differences in moral values and also ethical perspectives. And the third is that morality lies in the core of the human identity, shaping the individual choices, social relationships, and also perceptions of justice. And if you're actually asking me why that I choose this specific literary work, is that which is originally published in 1866, Crime and Punishment has been translated into more than 170 languages, demonstrating its enduring global relevances, according to the UNESCO Index Translationum. And also for the second one is that the novel has been recognized as one of the Guardian's 100 greatest novels, highlighting the significance in the world of literature. And also for the third is that through the characters of the main character, Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky explicitly questions the validity of the absolute morality, presenting a profound exploration of ethical relativism, guilt, and human consciences. And for the third slide is that the research gap and also question. Now, the research gap, from what I actually found interesting, is that most existing studies of crime and punishment has been focused on Raskolnikov's psychological condition of the novel's religious, very, very religious themes of sin, redemption, self-isolation, and also salvation, in contrast to postmodern approaches and also perspective that specifically examines the collapse of the morality and also like asking like why does everything like happen at the same time, that you're actually questioning everything at the same time, remains as very, very limited. Even though such a perspective offers a new dimension for interpreting aspects about the text and also have received relatively little scholarly attention. And so from this research gap question is that what I found is that two research questions. From the first one is how Dostoevsky construct the system of absolute morality through the characters of Raskolnikov in the narrative of Crime and Punishment. And also for the second question is that how is the collapse of absolute morality represented through the development of Raskolnikov's character and also the progressions from the novel's narrative. And so we're going to move to the theoretical framework, which is the postmodernism of the two pillars of theories, which is the Jean-François Lyotard and also Michel Foucault. And from Lyotard's perspective is that there is a writing from his perspective, from his art, from his literature, called The Postmodern Condition in 1979, which is the key concept from it is actually like a collapse of grand narratives. And according to him, the postmodern condition is characterized by the incredulity towards the meta-narratives comprehensive system, which is to believe that the claim of offer universal and absolute truths, including the absolute moral system, rather than accepting a single objective truth. Postmodernism recognizes the existence of multiple and competing perspectives. Now, which is from my finding is that if we actually applicate this to the novel, is that Raskolnikov's theory of the extraordinary man, which is he absolutely said, which is he explicitly, from which asserts as the exceptional individuals possess to the moral right to transcend extraordinary ethical laws, functioning as a grand narrative. Through the novel, however, this moral framework gradually collapses as Raskolnikov confronts guilt, psychological suffering, and the limitation of his own ideology. Dostoevsky thus exposes the instability of any claim of the absolute moral truth. And now for the second perspective, which is Michel Foucault, and in his argument written in his literature Discipline and Punish in 1979, which is there is a key concept called the power, knowledge, and moral norms. Foucault argues that power and knowledge are inseparable. Institution and social structures define what is considered moral, normal, and deviant, meaning that moral norms are not objective or universal truth, but rather a product of historically constructed power relations. Now, if we apply this to the Crime and Punishment and also Raskolnikov's behavior, from the Foucauldian perspective, Raskolnikov's rejection of the conventional morality can be interpreted as a resistance against the dominant moral discourse established by the society. He challenges His challenge to accept ethical norms illustrate the struggle against the power knowledge system that demonstrate the moral legitimacy. At the same time, the novel reveals how individuals remains deeply influenced by these social structures, demonstrating the complex relationship between personal agency, morality, and also power. And also, from my research methodology, there is the type of research is that the qualitative research design with a literary analysis approach focusing on textual interpretation rather than numerical data. But also the data resource is that from the translated version of the Crime Punishment by Richard Pevea and Larissa Volokonsky, and from the method of analysis, the study applies a close reading method involving in-depth examination of selective scenes, dialogues, and character development that reflects the theme of morality and a collapse of absolute moral values. Now, for the procedures, the identification of textual data, and then being classification of the based on theoretical concept of Jean-François Lyotard and Michel Foucault, and then the textual analysis and interpretation using postmodern framework, and also drawing the conclusion based on what the findings of this research. And now for the analysis of Raskolnikov's moral constructs, which is his main argument is that the extraordinary man theory. Raskolnikov believes that humanity can be divided into two categories: the ordinary people, who are bound by conventional moral laws, and the extraordinary people, figures such as like Napoleon, who possesses the right to transcend those moral boundaries in pursuit of greater purpose. His theory, intellectually constructed rather than impulsive conceived. Before committing the murder, Raskolnikov has already articulated these ideas in an academic articles demonstrating that his actions were grounded in a carefully developed philosophical framework rather than a moment of emotional impulse. From a postmodernism theory, this theory represents a personal ground narrative built upon rationalism instead of empathy or rational acceptance of moral values. Now, from this theory, from this extraordinary man theory, and Lyotard's theory, the connection to Lyotard's theory is that Raskolnikov's theory functions as the meta-narrative because it is claim of a universal truth regarding who is entitled and who is not entitled to transcend ordinary morality. This universalizing claim is precisely the type of grand narrative that Lyotard critiques in the postmodern condition. But in Foucault's theory of condition, the connection is that Raskolnikov's action constitute an explicit projection of a dominant moral norms established by society. By positioning himself above conventional ethical standards, he attempts to place himself outside the prevailing power knowledge system that determines what is considered morally acceptable or deviant. And now from the findings is that the demise from the absolute morality. And from the first phase is that the cognitive dissonance. After committing the murder, Raskolnikov does not experience a sense of like freedom or superiority or he had anticipated, but instead he falls seriously ill, endures intense psychological turmoil, and discovers that his moral theory is incapable of providing the peace and eternity and the uncertainty he expected. And from the second phase is that the external confrontation. Now his confrontation between Porfiry Petrovich, the investigating magistrate, and also the undercover cop, and also Sofia or Sonia Marmedelova, continuously challenges the foundations of his grand narrative. Through the encounters, Raskolnikov's philosophical convictions become increasingly unstable and also revealing that the gradual disintegration from both his psychological state and his moral certainty. And the last one, the third phase is the submission. Ultimately, chooses to confess, not because his legal evidence to leave him with no alternative, but rather because of his own moral system collapses from within. His confession represents the complete failure of the grand narrative that he constructed, demonstrating that his claim to the absolute moral authority cannot withstand the realities of guilt, consciousness, and the human experience. And so, from the conclusion, the Raskolnikov construct of grand narrative of absolute morality and test it through the murders, which is like his claim of being the extraordinary man. And this grand narrative gradually collapses through the cognitive dissonance confrontation, and also the confession. And the third one is that Dostoevsky argues that the Enlightenment rationalism, showing that claims of absolute morality cannot be sustained. And also for the last one is the expand of more of postmodern studies of the Russian classical literature, and also Lyotard and Foucault, while demonstrates the relevance of crime and punishment to contemporary moral discourse. And I think that's it all for all today. And thank you for your attention and have a good day.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nadim Raka Ibrahim, for your insightful presentations. We have explored how crime and punishment critiques the dangerous consequence of moral sovereignty and Enlightenment nationalisms. No. Okay. Thank you to all presenters for sharing your valuable research and perspective. From today's presentations, we can see various ways in which literature and language studies contribute to understanding ecological challenges and the changing relationships between human and more than human world. Now, due to a very limited time, we have a quick Q&A discussions. So for those participants who are curious, please please write your questions in the chat box. Please mention the name of the presenter you would like to address to and your questions. All right, if there are no questions, we shall proceed to the next agenda. I would like to express sincere appreciation to all presenters for sharing their valuable ideas and research findings, and to all participants for their active engagements. Today's discussions remind us that language and literature do not only represent the world around us, but also shapes the way we understand, imagine, and respond to ecological realities. May this discussion inspires further research and collaboration in exploring the relationships between humans, natures, and the wider ecological community. Thank you once again for your participation in the 5th online seminar on English Linguistics and Literature 2026. I am Muhammad Hidayah Rambang, and it has been an honor to moderate these sessions. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and please return to the main room.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.